So last time we talked about Gradio a bit, and I feel like maybe I didn't give a good sales pitch in terms of why you'd want to use Gradio, because you're just looking at small components, and a lot of times it can be hard to maybe see a library of UI components and figure out where that could get you. Like, why is this important? Why are UI components easy? Or why would I even want to build like a web app that just has the text form? There's a lot more that I could do with my life. I figured I could show one that I've used admittedly before, but it's been a minute. It's been about a year, maybe a year and a half since I've touched this. But it's around the generative AI portion where you're creating images. And I'll talk a little bit about how I use these kind of tools as opposed to just, I'm not trying to recreate realistic photos or anything like that, but I generally use it for brainstorming. And in one case in particular is when I'm trying to come up with iconography. So if I asked you, Jason, what is a symbol that might evoke security to you? Could you think of like an image or a picture or something that would bring that to mind?
I think of a padlock or something like that.
There you go. Padlock, shields, those kind of thing. Yeah, I
Mhm.
agreed. Oftentimes I get stuck when it's like, what about distributed tracing? Or what about looking at logs or something like that, that kind of
Yeah.
thing. And sometimes it's maybe a loop or what looks like a bunch of lines of text or something like that. So that's generally what I'm trying to do, is trying to think of a way that would visually describe something. Or if I'm trying to think of a description or maybe a mood. What's the color would do this? Or maybe what does like a youthful or happy layout look? I know this
Mhm.
all sounds silly, but if that's the reaction that I want from someone when they view an image, the question to me is what that image looks like, and then can I reverse engineer this in either Photoshop or Illustrator? I rarely, if ever, use these images on their own. I just want to say that, but it's not because they're not good. It's more that I feel like I can do that last mile, if that makes sense. But in
Yeah.
terms of a brainstorming tool, is pretty handy for me. So the tool I wanted to intro today is called Automatic1111. Now I realize that's not the best name for a project, but what we're going to talk about is this Stable Diffusion web UI. And in particular, this is actually built off of Gradio, which is what we were talking about last week. And I figured I'd talk a little bit about how it works. So at the very basic, it's an image generator. So what it'll do is generate images for you from text to image. So if you've got something that describes an image, it will give you an image for it. What's interesting though is it can also work in reverse. So you can give it an image and it can describe it for you, which is pretty handy for me when I'm thinking about how to like tag my Lightroom library. I haven't come up with an app just yet, but that's what I'd like to do eventually, is be able to give it a library or a new session and have it rate maybe the ones where the eyes are closed because I've messed up and pressed the shutter at the wrong button or something like that. That's where I'm getting to. I'm not there yet, but that's what's stuck in my head in terms of useful or utility in my daily life. Now, there are other things in here. You can train these models. You can do things like tokenization. There are some extensions. There are things, I think they're called checkpoints, where you can add to it. So let's say if I want to generate an image, I only want photorealism, or maybe I only want anime. Let's say I'm trying to make a new manga and I'm trying to come up with concepts like that. So you can give them different areas of expertise, which is pretty interesting. We talked a little bit about icons. There are sets for things like stickers or icons. I'm sure you've probably seen like the Dali sticker maker was pretty popular back in the day. But that's
Mhm.
where it goes. So I'm just going to quickly swap over to
Hmm.
my screen here, where I've cheated a little bit here in that I've got this already installed, but to install it on a Mac, and I'm using a Mac here just because I've got a little bit more memory on my Mac Studio. But these are the commands here. So it's on their webpage when you go under install. But it's essentially, there's a few things that are required. So of these that you might not have, CMake, Protobuf, and Rust, you may not have. You probably already have Git, wget, as well as Python. This is set to the 3.10, but you've probably got a more recent version installed. So you'll see if I go through this, it's already installed. It's totally fine. The next is to git clone into the repo, which is fine. So we're going to go into that repo, which is called Stable Diffusion. Now, if you use Stable Diffusion before, you know that there are some problems with this model. In particular, it doesn't do very well with words, and it doesn't do very well with fingers. So if you think back 2 years ago, what was image generation? What was the state of the art? What did it look like? This is that. We'll talk about how to make that a little bit better here in a moment. But in terms of how we get things up and running, this is that. Now to start it, we're going to use something called, I think it's called Start Web UI. So we're just going to look at that first. Maybe it's Web UI Start. It is in fact. Is it just webui.sh? My apologies, but I'll show you what it's actually doing. So it's just doing a quick look through to make sure everything on the system is okay. And in our case, it's going to catch right around the top here. So it's going to grab webui macOS env.sh. So if you're worried about what this is actually running, so it's essentially a strip that runs from top to bottom. There's no functions or methods or anything like that in here. And all it's going to do is start up a Gradio application, a web UI, and that web UI will allow us to start giving text that will give us images. So I'm just going to do that now. It's just that web UI. Yeah, go ahead.
So last time when we talked about Gradio and went over it,
Yep.
we grabbed a, what do they call them, from Hugging Face?
Yes.
What was those
I think they
things?
call them spaces.
Spaces, that's right.
Yes.
So is this pulling in from a space the same way, or how's this working?
It is not. Now, my understanding is there are spaces on Hugging Space that you could grab. So if you don't have local processing for this, for example, because it does actually require generally a lot of memory in order to create larger images, you could use it in a Hugging Space. The difference between the two, I think, might be speed. So you can generate things locally quite a bit faster than you could on the cloud, for example. That being said, if you need to generate, like you were saying, 1920 by 1080s, pretty expensive actually to generate an image that size. Normally you'd be looking at 500 by 500 or 512 by 512 kilobytes, sorry, pixels, which isn't very big. It's just stamp size. So if you need anything larger than that, chances are you need either a beefier computer or it'd be better to load up one of those spaces, as you were saying. Now, if you want to present that locally to your users and maybe gate it with a login, you could do that. Or if you want to have it run locally as well as opposed to run in the cloud and just present locally, you could also point at a local model to do that too if you want to build your own web UI. In this case, what it's doing is it's grabbing down Stable Diffusion on its own, so locally, and then it's loading up the model locally, and it will present everything locally. So this isn't a local-only solution, but you're absolutely right. There are many ways that you could slice and dice this, or maybe mix up this deployment if you wanted to.
Okay, great.
Now we talked about we talked a little bit in the green room about how this isn't great at generating images. So I tried to generate one of you as a test, for example, and obviously the text was wrong. So I'm going to try to avoid text. We talked about prompting. I think, what is a general thing that you ask it for prompting? Typically I will say the most interesting image, which is it's not the best prompt, I think, for testing, but it will tell you a little bit about the model. Now, before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about seeds. So I'm using random seeds here. Now, if we set this seed when we're going through and generating it, may be more similar the next time that we generate an image, but on random, typically if we generate an image after this, it's going to be completely different. The other thing is newer models in particular. So we're using Stable Diffusion 1.5. In particular, models that are Stable Diffusion 2 or XL and older will typically require something over 700 by 700 in terms of pixels or 1024 by 1024. So we're going to use 800 by 800, which should be fine. And again, remember, this is a very old model, so don't expect the results to be amazing, but expect it to be fast. So what we're going to do
I
is...
expect it to be as amazing as the first one I saw when you did it.
Yeah, so not great is what we're getting at here, folks.
Oh, it was great.
And then on the bottom here, I've got the built-in quote unquote GPU, the part of the Apple M2 GPU that's being used for this. We should actually see this increase in usage as we're using it to show that we're using the GPU side of the die as opposed to the CPU side. The only reason I mention this is because of speed. So when you're using the GPU accelerated side, it's quite a bit faster, but you get access to that shared memory. So in this case, I've got 64 gigabytes of memory, which is a lot, in fact, for image generation. And we can generate something like 1920 by 1080p. It'll take a minute, and you may want to have it sample a little bit longer to get more details, but we'll talk about that as we get to it. So if I generate this, I'm hoping that this GPU should get used. We should use more memory, and as a result, we should get an image at the bottom. Now, some of the apps based on this will actually show you a preview here that's fuzzy. This is an older one, so it doesn't. I do want to call out here that it's made a meme.
What is happening?
Let's see if we can actually find it. Okay, so this is one of the things that Stable Diffusion 1.5 will do. Now, there you can look at what it's trained on. Some of what it's trained on is Reddit, and it's trained on Reddit for a specific period of time. And I feel like during that period, this meme must have been popular because it's definitely the Dos Equis person.
I don't know why, but I still can't. I've been looking at it for like at least 60 seconds, and I still can't count how many fingers are on the left hand and like both of them. I don't know what I'm looking at.
Yeah. Now I will say, full disclosure, I actually love these older images because they're quaint, right? There are definitely problems with them.
It's, early art. Yeah.
Now, there's a couple, if you've not dealt with image generation in a minute, there are some few prompt engineering things that we can do around this to make it not look so awful or cursed. So, one is we didn't specify if it's going to be black or white. We also didn't say, please don't give us weird fingers, which can be handy. The other thing is that there are different ways of changing our prompt, both in the positive way. So, we've got this up here. So, let's say we could say in color. And I'm going to put this in the Canadian spelling, which funnily enough can change things a little bit because the tokens might be a little bit different. The other would
Huh.
be if we typed in weird hands or just weird, maybe in here, we could get rid of anything that looks weird.
Careful, it's my family.
Fair enough. The correct number of fingers is what we're looking for in particular. So even this might be a little bit better, but the other thing we can do is start sampling more. Now, I don't think we've talked about neural networks and generative adversarial networks, which is where this came from. But imagine, Jason, if you and I had an argument about the most interesting image and what it would look like. I might say it should have mountains, and you may say it should have a human. And we can start there and start having that argument. Now, that's interesting as a two-person argument. It's way more interesting as a 20-person argument, and it becomes unmanageable at the 200, 2,000, 2 million neural nodes here arguing about what it looks like. But that's how it works. It's like a really big argument of what it really looks like. And as we go through our sampling steps, it's almost how many generations we have this argument for, including things that we've learned in the past. So if we change this to something like 40, it should get a little bit better in terms of detail. The other thing I'll say is that in terms of what it's been tested on, there is sorry, this is it's almost nightmarish.
Creepy.
What I want to say is that depending on how it was trained, it may be trained on tags, and the tags could be voluntary. For example, in Flickr, you may have a lot of people tagging things with interesting, but they may not be interesting. And in fact, this crowd photo or what it's trying to do, it looks like it's got to be royalty or something like that. It's just not there yet.
To me, it looks like something from like the inner cover of a Zappa album or something.
Oh, interesting. Now, again, this is getting more detailed as we go more into it, but if we're using a random seed again, so we don't know which seed we've done. But if I can do something like a high-res fix, and this is going to upsample it, and we're going to need to talk over this as well because it's going to take us a second. But as we go through more sample steps and more upsampling, we'll get more and more detail. Now, we said it should not be weird. I don't think it necessarily nailed the should not be weird directive. But the other thing we can see here is that as we're taking more sampling steps, we're getting more of that, those blurry in process. I don't know what you call them, artifacts or things that are just off to the side. But I actually really enjoy this portion as well. We're trying to come out with, I don't know if it's a layout or some sort of graphical design, but like you can see it coming into blurriness. It's like you're waking up and you've rubbed your eyes and you're trying to see something.
It is.
I just find this incredibly
Yep.
interesting. This is definitely not the exercise, but I find this stuff cool. It looks like we're getting into more of a collage here again.
It seems a little less terrifying, I'd say, so far.
That's just it. It's the more detailed they become, the more of the uncanny valley it seems like we're into, and the more weird they get into. I'll change this prompt in a minute because this prompt can be fraught with errors, but it tells me generally a lot about the model and how it's been trained.
Yeah, and to be honest, like weird is a little subjective.
Yes.
I'm a little weird. I don't know what that means exactly. We could probably be more specific on just, I'm guessing, like what exactly we would think is a negative about certain aspects.
You got it. Yeah. It's definitely going to be a little bit different depending on the person. And we can change this, of course. We can make it something else if we want to change it.
Can you is it work like keywords? Can you just put in a bunch of like comma separated?
You got it. Yeah, it's comma separated. So what you got any tips here? What else could we do?
Well, I don't know. Maybe we should see what this one looks like, and then if it helps dial it in. But then again, I don't want to derail you either. On
no worries. We got a couple minutes here. It takes a minute. The only thing I want to show
taking a while.
Yeah, it's because we did the high-res fix. We also set it from 40 samples to 100, which is going to be like double the time. So not only did we more than double our time, but we're also adding like a high-res fix to it.
And you can see the GPU clocking it out too.
Absolutely. And that's the other thing that the reason I've got this up here is that it may seem trivial because we're using these image generators on the web. You might be using Apple's Animoji, which I feel like they haven't said it, but I feel like is based on the same text because it's got some of the same issues. It does take a minute. And there are things that you can do on your phone, for example. I think Apple's got, I'm trying to think of the name, Draw Things is the name of the app that you can get on the App Store, for example, for free and run this offline. Depending on your phone, you probably have 6 or 8 gigabytes of memory. And you could start generating images like this as well if you're just trying to come up with some brainstorming, that kind of stuff. You can certainly do it offline on your phone. And in fact, depending on your computer, it may be faster than your computer to generate on your phone as opposed to on there. So I realize this is probably like watching paint
Yeah.
dry here as we go
No.
through this process, but
At least it does give you some feedback. I think that's some of the most frustrating tools I play with is that you just
right.
sit there and you're like, okay, is anything happening? So visual feedback, again, for me is a big key, or big bonus.
Now, have you played around with giving some of these models images to have them describe things? Like one of my first tests was, what's that meme? Look at this Datadog graph, and you give it a graph and you say, describe what's going on.
Yeah.
And I've had pros and cons. Sometimes it works well, sometimes it doesn't.
Mhm.
Even images of my own. I made like an artistic merit checker, for example,
Yeah.
using one of the Llama Vision models, and I gave it Starry Night. And I said, hey,
Mhm.
rate this in terms of artistic merit. And I think they were like, the artist could do better, maybe a little bit more contrast. The swirly stuff in the sky is a little bit distracting. Maybe remove that, which is really interesting to me because it's like a milk toast approach to art. Like, what is the generic reply that you might have to like a work of art? They're saying
Yeah.
like, could be better, like 50 out of 100 kind of thing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We don't need to hear their opinions on that.
But I do
Yeah. It's
find that in reverse is pretty cool.
yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so much of this. So to answer your question, I have done that before,
Okay.
given an image and have it described, but really just out of curiosity to see what it thinks. I don't really have a lot of use cases for that, and every good use case that I can think of for like accessibility needs to be able to understand what things are,
Right.
there are tools that do it a million times better than I could ever attempt to do it. So
Right.
it was like one of those things that I think a lot of people like, oh, this is like an interesting technical solution that has been created here recently,
Right.
and we can see it for ourselves was like my experience just to try it out. But then from there it's okay, hot dog or
Hot dog, not hot
dog.
dog.
Like I can tell the difference too.
So one of the things you mentioned in there, and I'm glad you touched on it, is accessibility. So the question is maybe if my vision is deteriorating, could there be a system that, again, this doesn't need to be cyberpunk or anything like that, but imagine the Ray-Ban smart glasses that could describe and say, hey, there's a bus in front of you. Maybe don't continue walking. It's a big yellow object. Pretty sure it's a bus, but it's definitely a vehicle, that kind of thing.
Hmm.
The other thing that we can do in these models is, and again, I'm trying not to put on the black hat here, but for accessibility reasons, perhaps we'd like to help people decipher those codes. It says, what are the letters in this text before getting in? Not a
Hmm.
CAPTCHA or a reCAPTCHA, but some of them are very difficult actually for me to even decipher, and I
Yeah.
have to hit call me or whatever. Sometimes this can help with those, in fact, as well, for people who can't actually see the image or can't get past it. The other thing, of course, is that black hat people are starting to use this to get past captures in terms of their web scraping workflows and things like that
Yeah,
as
I was
well.
just about to say, if we can
Sorry.
help somebody use that to solve that problem, you've also solved the problem for
Oh,
the bad
unfortunately, yeah,
guys.
you got it.
But
Which does appear to be the current state of the art. Now, I will admit that this is still generating in the background. I may have bitten off a little bit more than I can
is
chew,
it? Wow.
but it is going, yes.
Okay, at least your computer's hanging in there. It's not.
It's not, yeah, it's certainly not falling over yet. You can see the GPU is being used though, and this is one of the things I really do want to show, so I'm glad I could. Now, this is an M2 Ultra, so it's non-trivial in terms of a processor, and it does have 64 gigabytes of memory, which is, I'm not going to say is all being used by this. It's probably only using a portion of it, but it will cycle in and out of that portion. I think this model is going to take up about 16 gigabytes, I think max, and by default will take about 8, so it shouldn't be too bad.
So to me, the main downfall of this is
Yes,
I don't think we've got the patience for this type of wait
also
and
true.
see when we're experimenting,
Also true.
which is like the next hurdle for us to figure out. This.
Now, when I was doing this a year ago, what I would do is queue up a bunch of generations, and I would take more of a curatorial approach to this. So I would run things overnight, and then I
Mhm.
would wake up in the morning and kind of look through different generations. One I ran for weeks on ends because I actually had a good idea. I thought I had a good idea in mind, and I had it run for a really long time to figure out, like, does it get better or worse? One thing I noticed is that, so we've got it set to 100 sampling steps. You can set this quite large, in fact, where you can go through many generations as you want. There does seem to be a point where it doesn't get any better, and it seems to be, at least for me, it was around 100 with this model. It may differ on others. And
Hmm.
I'll talk a bit about some of the maybe state of the art here in a moment, but it doesn't seem to get any better than 100 sampling steps. It tends to just devolve into the same kind of image. And then you can play around with your The temperature is one, but play around with that seed instead of using a random seed. If you use like a static seed, you've got the image you want, you've got the detail level you want. What you want to do is just play around with it just a little bit. So you either play with the temperature or that seed, and you can get a little bit closer. But this is when you're really trying to create like a JPEG that you want to use, as opposed to something that you're just using as inspo. So I think that's a little bit different when you're looking at one
Would you
versus the other. Go ahead.
would you mind going back to your screen?
Of
So
course, yeah.
the model that this is using, is
Yes.
that described right there? Yeah. So that's, to me, I'm not familiar with that, looking at that. So is that one of the stable diffusions, like standard?
Gotcha. Yeah,
Um,
I'll pull up the description of this one for sure. So it's 1.5, which again is a little bit old, but I should be able to pull up the model description here. Yeah, sorry. I'm just pulling up in Stable Diffusion. My
and is this
apologies.
one that requires some funding too? Like you'll need to fund like a wallet or something
I don't
to make.
think so. I
No.
think this one is pretty much open source, is my
Okay.
understanding.
Oh,
So
I
this
see.
is it here. It's Stable Diffusion
Oh, it is in Hugging
1.5
Face. Okay,
prune
cool.
EMEA, but like this is where they all live. Again, note that it says legacy deprecated. I'm probably in the minority here, but I do the older models because they're funny. But it is old. You probably want SDXL or SD 2.0 or 2.1 is probably what you want. I do like these ones because it shows you what you need to do basically in terms of positive and negative prompting and then thinking about the temperature and stuff like that. Some of this stuff is handled for you by default these days. I was trying to log in here so I could actually show people what it looks like in Flux, but I'll see if I can bring up a Flux one as well. But I do want to compare, like, there are different models and different, I guess, implementations of the
Yeah.
models that will generate different results.
Okay. Yeah, that was going to be one of my next questions, is why. Because I guess for me, like my example earlier, where I just came up with an idea real quick, and I'm like, oh, if I can just add this to my slides, that'll help me paint the narrative I'm telling. That's how it works for me. Is I'll just have an idea, and I'll see if Dolly or whatever I'm thinking of, whatever tools I want to play with, I just experiment, see what it can do. But outside of that, I don't really have a recurring use case for it.
Gotcha.
So yeah, the question comes down to why choose this over one of the online services like through OpenAI or Google Gemini, because the model's not necessarily local, right? You're still calling an open source one, but it's not running locally.
These ones are running locally.
Oh, they are. Oh, okay.
For these ones. On the Stable Diffusion side, you can do it either way with Gradio.
Okay.
This one is local.
So
I
but it's one of the
guess.
smaller ones that was just downloaded earlier in the process before you got it
Yeah, you got it. So
running. Yeah.
this is the default, just because this is what it was built to ship with. I think a lot of people would use this. I find it interesting as maybe like a historical kind of thing. So like maybe an art history kind of thing. So like in
Mm-hmm.
2023, people thought this was the state of the art, and here's how
Yeah.
silly it looked. And that's only 2 years ago, so that's why I find it funny. I think in terms of using it offline, it might be more of like a, let's say you signed up for an account to a WordPress blog, I don't know, 2016, and they generated like a gravatar for you. It might
Mm-hmm.
be something like that where I want you to be able to sign up and get an image generated of you automatically, let's say with a top hat or something like that. Everybody gets a top hat. You upload an image, I put a top hat on you. That's just part of how we do our user sign up. What I want to do though is not pay per sign up. So the naive approach to this might be, let's have Dali do it, let's have Midjourney do it, that kind of thing. But then I realized my cost of acquisition of getting users in is higher because it has to make an API call, or maybe the sign up process is longer as a result. So maybe there's some things that I want to do locally. It could be on like a cloud instance or what have you, or maybe it's some things that were due to security reasons. If the user uploads an image, I don't want to send that off to a third-party model just because I don't want to display their image into something else and don't want to be trained by it, that kind of thing. I think there's also the argument where something like censorship might come around. Like, I don't want to talk politics or anything like that, but it could be in different regions that some things they just can't generate depending on the stuff that's out there. Might be some of that too. But I think more than anything, it's more about making sure that you're controlling that uptime as part of something that might be critical to your process when you're hosting a service that generates images. I think it's more like that, or if you've got like a degraded kind of level. So let's say premium gets DALI 2, or maybe Midjourney even for premium, and then free user gets DALI, and then maybe the user hasn't even signed up, just uses Stable Diffusion, and we let them know, hey, these are Stable Diffusion credits you're using. Obviously, it's going to look a lot better once you sign in, that kind of thing. So it's
Hmm.
more of that
Okay.
degradation, if that makes
Yeah, yeah,
sense.
yeah.
Sorry, we're at 93% here. This is like watching paint dry.
So close. Is it coming? Is it coming in a little more
I think
clear?
so. Yeah, it was blank a moment
Or
ago
should
when
we
I
wait?
looked at it. Oh
Oh,
no,
okay.
it's still blank. Yeah,
It's gonna
we'll
be a
see.
do a big reveal.
Yeah, big reveal. Hopefully it's good. But I think in terms
So
of image generation, that's the main thing that I'm looking for is more that ideation or coming up with something. A lot of times it will be like, or the dream, I guess, for me is to mass tag something or
mhm.
help me with tagging with something. Or if I've taken an image that's in a certain style, but I don't know how to describe it, I'll use the reverse to tell me like what that style was so I can go out there and maybe do like a series or something like that. Or
Mm,
another artist that's related I might want to know about, do some
mm.
research.
Do you know what would happen if you opened up another tab for
Yeah.
your app and tried another one run separately? Is that going to crash the whole thing and melt your MacBook?
I don't think it will, unfortunately.
Not that I'm advocating for that. A little chaos monkeying around, but I'm just still thinking about how this thing, how this app, this Gradio app,
Right.
which you talked about previously, how it works behind the scenes. Oh boy, here we go.
So my
And
understanding is that it's okay. Because before I don't think it did this. My understanding is that
oh,
it
there's a
run both
queue.
at the same time, it would
Interesting.
actually be a problem.
Yeah, I was
Um,
hoping for a fight over the GPU.
yeah, having done this in the past, that is what I noticed actually, and it was not good. This is pretty smart, so it must be reusing the back end in order to do so, which is great. So it's not all
Okay.
self-contained. But yes, I've also done queuing because you can put in multiple prompts and it will queue, which is pretty cool.
Right
I
on.
didn't realize in multiple tabs it would do that because I have made that mistake where I'm running two tabs at once and have forgotten about it, unfortunately,
Or
and
yeah,
everything's slow as a result.
I like lose tabs or minimize something. So while we're on the screen, we haven't really looked into those other tabs there, the textual inversion,
Right.
any of them. Is there anything interesting in those, or have you looked through them?
Yeah, there is. I've only used a couple of these on my.
Oh my goodness.
So this is Jason Hand. That's certainly a
This
hand.
is how it always goes.
Oh man.
Artists' jobs are
What
fine.
happened here
So
obviously is that this was in the queue and you saw how quickly it ran through. Like five by five is pretty easy for it. Oh wow. Oh no. It got all the way to the end and it failed the high res
uh
fix, I think here right
oh.
here.
Is that because of us firing up a new thing, or do you think there's no
No.
conflict at all?
No, I think there's actually another issue.
Huh. Okay.
Not enough precision
Interesting.
to give the picture. But again, we could do 10 sample steps here and we could see what it was trying to do
Hmm.
in color as opposed to. And again, the only
So
difference between 10 and 100 is going to be more or less detail. But you can see how long it takes. I guess is the other thing I was trying to say. Okay, this is
this
probably
is
something similar to what it was working on, but
I
not
like
as
this
much
one the
detail.
best for sure. It doesn't have any creepy people.
I do find landscapes fare a lot better than anything to do with humans. I think our maybe our forgiveness for how weird our landscape can look is
Yeah.
maybe a little bit more. But yeah,
Well,
I'm just gonna quickly test this
I
side
like
just
that
to
one.
make sure. Yeah, it like I feel like mountains are pretty
Mhm.
easy for a lot of these old ones. Have we ever talked about Bryce before? Do you recall Bryce 3D? Does that ring a bell?
I don't believe I have.
Okay, so Bryce was a 3D image generating piece of software, maybe in the late 90s, early 2000s, that would generate like futuristic, otherworldly kind of images.
Mm.
Okay, and this did fail again, so it's just a high
Uh-oh.
res step. Is
Hmm.
no, that's fine. We've proven what the
We've
actual problem was. But it does feel like that kind of area where you're thinking about alien landscapes, that kind of thing, is maybe something where this
mm,
could be handy with. Because I'm not. You're talking about video games, right? If I'm trying to imagine an alien landscape for a video game, that's not my subject. Like I'm not an SME in this area. I
mm,
should probably have something else help me.
yeah.
Maybe I could hire somebody. Maybe I could get started with some.
I see it as just the new way to doodle around.
Right.
Previously I would get my iPad out or some pad of paper or something and just come up with some ideas and just see what resonates with me. And this is a new way to come up with a bunch of ideas that you really just plant the seed. It's your brainchild, and then something else takes a good portion of it the rest of the way, or it's a collaborative thing. But it's still just as I think just giving you more options to choose from and help you generate ideas.
Yes. Okay, so I think I've covered the local use case, and I'll talk a little bit about what I've done in the past. So
Okay.
I'm just going to quickly show what it did here. Oh, my apologies, that is me. So this is, again, I just told it to make icons, for example, and it's made a few instead of one, which is interesting. So we've
Yeah.
got multiple different options here, so we can look at them. So I think it's done 5 up. Looks like 4 up. So it's done a few.
Okay.
I wouldn't say these are like icons. There's a red
Yeah.
hat in this one, which is interesting. But the other options we can do is say start with one of those images and generate another one in its style. The other thing we can do is go backwards. So if we're doing textual inversion, so we're going from one end to the other, I think is how that works. There's sketching, which I haven't necessarily done too much, but I did want to talk about inpainting a little bit here, just because Stable Diffusion can be used as a plugin for Photoshop. And I'm not sure if you've used Photoshop in a minute, but Photoshop now has
I
like
haven't.
a generate. Let's say like my hair is messy today. Let's say I want to generate just the messy part, like fix that portion. You can circle it in Photoshop and say generate. And I'm not going to say it's great. In fact, it's probably passable most of the time. But if you play with the opacity between what's generated and what you saw, you can typically get to something that's okay,
Mm.
believable. It's
Good for
actually pretty handy.
touch-ups.
Yeah, and the fact that you can add Stable Diffusion, like exactly what we've just run now, as a web UI endpoint for Photoshop in order to use this instead of using their credits can be pretty handy when you're going through like just a sample retouch kind of thing without again involving Photoshop's credit system or whatever your creative cloud license is in order to get access to those features without burning through those credits that you might need to use. So that's one of the things that I've used it for in the past. Then I think they got a little bit faster and they gave me more credits. I think it made more sense. But I'm honestly just removing like dust specks and things like that a lot of the time. So it doesn't really matter in the quality, just so I can get rid of it kind of thing. So that's what I've used these kind of things for. And again, trying to use it for image tagging. But that's where I'm at with Automatic 1111. Like it's an easy way to stand up a model that I can use for Photoshop, that I can use for brainstorming. I can use it for inpainting. That's the primary use case I've had. I have used it for image to image before to some success, but a lot of times it's more for that brainstorming step.
Awesome. Okay.
Yeah.
Another check in the W column. What's the metaphor I'm looking for Gradio
Yeah,
in terms of
it
being very useful for.
it seems pretty prevalent. You'll notice once you see this kind of UI that there's quite a few tools like just haphazardly stuck together and
Mm.
you'll load off to the web. I'm not going to say the GUI of this one's great. In fact, if you think about step 1, 2, and 3, what you need to do to generate an image, feels like they should be in order as opposed to spread out across that page. But it's a free app, so it's hard to complain.
There's a balance depending on who your audience is. Some people like a lot of control, especially when they're experimenting with things. And unlike Dolly and some of the other online providers, like you don't have a lot of options that you can, not as many, it seems like, that you can really twist the knobs and try to dial in some things and be much more patient because it's not costing you a bunch of money. Although time wise, it still might take some time to generate depending on your
Absolutely. And I didn't talk
outputs.
about monitoring this too much, but one of the things that you probably want to do is look at the logs of what you're creating, which is
Oh,
this
yeah.
will give you. And then the next is like how long it's taking with which models being used. I think it's maybe the key. So looking at the parameters, the model being used, and then figure out like how long it's taking to create each one. Different models will have different steps. We had an error in here, which would be fun to track down. It says that we can disable not a number checking in Python, but that just sounds wrong to me.
Hmm.
If you're trying to divide by 0, it sounds like you should probably fix something else. So those kind of problems you could probably get into. I'm assuming that's what then nan means, or maybe you're trying to use a string as an int, which is a whole other problem. But those sort of error checking kind of things would help if you're trying to help out on the Automatic 1111 side to help them with their software. Obviously, again, love the software, but there are some things in here that we could probably fix. I personally think if you deployed this to like a team of people, Rum would tell you pretty quickly where they're using the app, for example, and it might cause you to change the layout of the app,
That's a good point. Yeah.
which,
What if we
again, I don't
yeah.
want poo poo a free piece of software on their layout, but I do feel like it could be better, for example.
Yeah. I guess that could be a fun little side quest here with these apps is to throw rum on there because that's a pretty straightforward instrumentation.
Yeah, at the very
Copy and
least, the
paste.
heat map, yeah, would typically tell you what you want to know. The other is when we talked about this, and maybe a bit in passing, but what normal is in terms of wait time, like 10 seconds feels like that's our appetite right now for AI. 3 minutes is super long, especially if you're iterating through. And if you want to approach that 10-second target, then obviously you're going to have to look at, do I use a different model, different hardware, what have you?
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely can confirm that in my experiments with local models is like there's lots of benefits for it running locally, but speed is not one.
That's correct.
So trade-offs somewhere.
That's correct.
Awesome. We're probably getting close to time for
Indeed.
today. Was there anything else we needed to share regarding
That's
Automatic
about it. I
1111?
think the only other thing is, and listen, I realize this is pre-recorded, but if we could get people letting us know tools that they've found interesting, that would be amazing to me. I know it's going to take a minute to get there, but as we socialize this, I think that's one of the main things I'd like to see. If there's other tools people are using or interested in, I would love to try them.
Why don't I'll set up a form or something somewhere where we
Ooh.
can point people to and see if they want to suggest some stuff. I almost said that they could suggest some things in our repo as an issue
Mm.
or something, but But yeah, we'll give it some thought. We'll come
Sorry
up
to
with
drop that on you live there.
No, I
but
think
yeah,
that's
kind of where I'm at.
we've already been saying it to everybody, so we might as well just give them like an official place to give us that feedback. We've got things. I don't know.
In the
Actually,
list.
yeah. So my next thing is Claude Code, which I actually
Right.
started playing with today,
Awesome.
and I'm trying to build a little app doing that. And I've got so many others, but Claude Code's going to be the next one that I'm going to try to talk about. Although it may not be next week. We've decided we might have to get creative next week or do
if
nothing.
anyone sees this, where are we going to be next week?
We will be at the NVIDIA's GTC conference, which is a lot of things, but big AI conference. So we're going to be out there learning from the other AI people in the space and in other spaces. Honestly, that's kind of neat thing about this one that I like is it's not our usual just web operations space. It's like
Absolutely
a lot of industries and people who have no idea who Datadog is, which is refreshing.
it is.
And yeah, so that's what we'll be with our learning caps on.
All right, folks.
But then the next week, maybe we'll talk about Claude Code.
Absolutely. I'm here for it. I can't wait.
Yeah. Okie dokie. Good seeing you, and
Great chatting.
we'll talk to you all later.
All right, folks. Bye bye.